You see a solid black line on a map, and you just assume it's absolute, right?
Oh, yeah, completely. You think it's locked in.
Yeah, it's like engineering or something. You assume someone somewhere walked out with like surveyor's transit,
Yeah.
agreed on the exact coordinates, and well, and that's that.
Right, the hard science of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It is comforting to think the world is perfectly categorized into yours, mine, but if you step into the world of international frontiers, specifically the Indo-Tibet-China border, that precision just vanishes. It vanishes into thin air.
It really does. It completely shatters the illusion of modern cartography, honestly.
It does, because, I mean, we are looking at a dispute where one side brings, centuries-old revenue receipts to the negotiating table, and the other essentially brings a blank slate.
Yeah, because the reality is 19th century empires didn't have GPS. They didn't have satellite imaging.
Right.
They operated with fluid frontier zones, like buffer states, and areas where imperial influence just sort of faded out like a gradient rather than, stopping at a hard brick wall.
Which brings us right into the meat of today's deep dive. Welcome to it, by the way. We are exploring a source text for you today titled The Vexed Indo-Tibet-China Border.
It's a heavy one, but a good one.
Oh, absolutely.
Powerful.
And our goal today is to act as your personal geopolitical historians and answer one really big central question for you. Why did different interpretations of history and geography create a boundary dispute that has remained locked in a stalemate for decades?
It's the multi-billion-dollar question, really.
It is. Now, an important disclaimer before we start unpacking the evidence. Our source material outlines specific historical claims, treaties, and geographic positions, primarily from an Indian administrative perspective, as well as the Chinese counter-arguments that this specific text document.
Right, which is an important distinction to make.
Exactly. We are impartially examining the architecture of this dispute based strictly on what the text presents. We are not endorsing either side's political viewpoints. We're just looking at what the document says.
And that is, honestly, the perfect lens to look through. Because to understand how ancient, fluid frontiers evolved into rigid, heavily militarized boundaries, I want you to keep a specific memory framework in mind as we talk today.
Okay, I love a good framework. Lay it on me.
Think of it as an equation. History plus geography plus law plus control equals a boundary claim.
Wait, let me repeat so it sinks in. History plus geography plus law plus control.
Exactly. Equals a boundary claim. You cannot understand this dispute by looking at just one of those variables. You need all four.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the text talks about a massive 3,440-kilometer border. And the core deadlock seems to be that these two nations approach the very concept of a boundary from, well, fundamentally incompatible starting points.
Completely incompatible, night and day.
Right. So according to the source, India's stance relies heavily on legacy. The text notes they base their claims on defined treaties, established customs, and historical administrative control.
Yeah, they basically look at the historical timeline and say, hey, the lines were already drawn. Which is why they point to things like the Johnson Line in the north and the McMahon Line in the east as established facts. India also anchors its argument heavily in geography, specifically the watershed principle.
Let's actually explain the mechanics of the watershed principle, because it's not just some arbitrary line drawn on paper. It's actually really cool.
Oh, it makes perfect geographic sense.
Right, it relies on the natural topography of the Himalayan mountain ranges. Basically, if you stand at the absolute highest crest of the mountain ridge, gravity dictates where the water flows.
Yep. High school physics.
Exactly.
Right.
If a drop of rain falls and flows north into the Tibetan Plateau, that land is Chinese territory. If it flows south into the Indian subcontinent, that's Indian territory. It uses nature as the ultimate arbiter.
It is a highly logical, internationally recognized method for drawing borders in mountainous terrain. Honestly, it's used all over the world.
But China doesn't buy it for this border, right?
No. China's stance, according to the text, fundamentally rejects this whole legacy-based approach. China argues that the Sino-Indian boundary was never formally or mutually delimited.
So they just view all those earlier colonial-era lines as illegitimate impositions.
Exactly. They say, we didn't sign off on this, the imperial powers did.
It's like two neighbors arguing over a property line. One has an old folder full of faded receipts, a deed from the previous owner, and points to the river as the natural fence.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right. And the other neighbor says, I didn't sign any of that. The previous owner didn't have the right to sell it to you. We need to draw a completely new line today. No wonder there's a deadlock.
That is exactly the dynamic. One nation is trying to enforce historical contracts, the other is arguing the entire contract system was invalid to begin with.
So to make sense of how this deadlock actually plays out on the ground, the text divides the 13,000 square kilometers of claimed territory into three distinct regions.
Right. It helps to build a mental map. You have the western sector, the central sector, and the eastern sector.
Let's dive into the western sector first, because this area is just a fascinating web of historical documents. We're talking about Ladakh, and specifically the high-altitude regions like Aksai Chin, Changshanmo, and Demchok.
Yeah, and the source lays out a timeline of Indian evidence for this area that stretches back centuries. I mean, it starts with Ladakh's association with India way back in 1580.
1580, that's wild.
Yeah, and then it cites a 1684 peace treaty signed at Tingmusgang after a war between Ladakh and Tibet.
And what did that 1684 treaty actually say about the border?
Well, the crucial takeaway from that 1684 treaty is that it established a frontier that, according to the Indian claim anyway, remained unchanged.
Okay, so that's the baseline.
Right. But then the dynamic shifts in the 19th century. In 1841, the Maharaja of Jammu and Kashmir sends an army led by General Zorawar Singh. They push deep into the region, conquering territory all the way to Mansarovar Lake.
Which sets the stage for what seems to be the absolute linchpin of the Western sector argument, the Treaty of 1842.
Exactly. The 1842 treaty is central to this.
The text details that this was an agreement between Maharaja Gulab Singh, the Emperor of China, and the Lama Guru of Lhasa. And India argues this treaty reaffirmed the traditional historical boundary between Ladakh and Tibet.
Yes. But, as you can probably guess, China pushes back aggressively on the validity of this 1842 treaty.
Oh, of course. What are their objections? Because it seems like a formal treaty to me.
China's documented objections are actually multi-layered. First, they argue the treaty isn't binding because the Chinese central government didn't send a direct representative to negotiate it.
Meaning they never formally ratified it.
Exactly. Second, they point out that the treaty didn't define the boundary with exact coordinates. It just merely referenced abiding by the, quote, old agreement, which China argues is way too vague.
I mean, fair enough on the coordinates thing, it was 1842.
Right. And third, they claim the consent of Xinjiang was not obtained.
Let's define Xinjiang quickly for clarity for everyone listening. That is the historical name for what is now China's Xinjiang province, which sits just north of the disputed area.
Right. Now, the text provides India's rebuttal to these Chinese objections, and I have to say it's a sharp counter-argument.
Let's hear it.
Regarding ratification, India argues the treaty simply didn't require it based on the diplomatic norms of the time. Plus, the Emperor of China was explicitly named as a party in the text anyway.
Okay, so the name was on the paper.
Yep. But the Indian rebuttal regarding Xinjiang is where the historical friction really shows. The text points out that Xinjiang did not even become a formalized Chinese province until 1884.
Wait, 1884. So India is essentially asking, if Xinjiang didn't officially become a province until 1884, how could anyone expect them to sign a treaty in 1842?
Exactly.
It feels like applying modern bureaucratic rules to 19th century empires, like asking for a PDF from a guy using a quill.
That is exactly what it's like. The text also notes that China actually adhered to the trade provisions established in that 1842 treaty all the way until 1946.
Wait, they used the trade provisions for a century without complaining.
Yeah, without ever raising an objection. So India argues that participating in the treaty's trade benefits for a century proves China implicitly accepted the agreement.
Wow. Okay, so we have this deep historical treaty-based quagmire in the West. But let's look at the geography itself for a second.
Okay.
Because Aksai Chin is an incredibly remote, freezing, high-altitude desert.
It is essentially a wasteland. It is virtually uninhabitable.
So why does this specific barren piece of geography become such a high-stakes strategic prize for China? I mean, why fight over it?
This is where we have to connect those historical claims to brutal geographic reality. While the text details the treaty arguments, the real strategic value of Aksai Chin is about sheer connectivity.
Connectivity, how so?
Aksai Chin is a high-altitude plateau that provides the most viable, relatively flat overland route connecting China's restive western province of Xinjiang directly to Tibet.
Ah, so it's not about the rocks or the resources. It's a military highway.
Precisely. For China, securing that specific corridor wasn't just about winning a historical debate over some 1842 treaty. It was a non-negotiable strategic imperative. They needed it to allow troop movements and maintain administrative control over their vast western peripheries.
That geographical utility drives their entire posture in the Western sector.
Completely. Its form-following function.
That structural reality explains so much of the tension. But interestingly, that tension isn't uniform across the whole border. If we shift our focus from the west to the middle of the map, the central sector, the narrative changes completely.
Yes, the central sector is essentially the exception that proves the rule.
We're talking about smaller regions here, right? Like Burahoti and Neelanjuthaing.
Yeah, exactly. And historically, there have been far fewer border skirmishes and standoffs here compared to the west or the east.
And the source points directly to the Sino-Indian Agreement of 1954 as the reason why. That agreement formally confirmed that the central sector had traditionally been under Indian control.
Right. And it shows that when you actually have a modern, mutually recognized agreement covering a specific area, the ancient ambiguities just disappear and the military tensions evaporate with them.
It's almost refreshing.
It is. Unfortunately, that diplomatic clarity completely broke down when they looked further east.
Which brings us to the eastern sector, historically known as the Northeast Frontier Agency, or NEFA, which is modern-day Arunachal Pradesh. And this entire sector revolves around one specific, highly contested boundary line.
The infamous McMahon Line.
The McMahon Line. Let's talk about it.
So the text details a tripartite conference held in Simla between 1913 and 1914. Representatives of India, China, and Tibet all sat down to formalize the traditional boundary.
And the British representative, Sir Henry McMahon, literally drew a red line on the treaty map to demarcate the border, right?
Literally a red line, yeah.
Oh.
And the source outlines 4 specific dimensions that India uses to legitimize this McMahon Line.
Okay, let's break those down. First, we've got the historical dimension.
Right, which is just the treaty itself, the fact that the Simla Convention happened and the line was drawn.
Then there's the ethnic dimension. The text notes that the tribal communities inhabiting these frontier areas share cultural and ethnic affinities with the northeastern tribals of India, not with the Tibetan population to the north.
Exactly. Then you have the administrative dimension.
Which means what, practically?
It means India asserts that it has historically exercised full administrative functions in the region. Collecting revenue, executing development plans, integrating the local population into the national mainstream.
So it wasn't just a line on a map, it was an actively governed space.
Exactly. And finally, the legal dimension, which brings us right back to the watershed principle we discussed earlier.
Right, the rain falling on the mountain crest.
Yes, the McMahon Line intentionally follows the highest crests of the Himalayan watershed. But the text points out a glaring contradiction here.
Oh, this is my favorite part of the text. Because China completely rejects the watershed principle for its border with India.
Right.
Yep, they say it doesn't apply.
But they actually utilized that exact same geographical principle when drawing its boundary treaties with Nepal and Burma in 1960.
It is a massive contradiction, and it's a powerful point of leverage in India's argument. If the watershed principle is an internationally valid metric for determining your borders with Nepal and Burma, why is it suddenly invalid when applied to India?
It's a great question. But just as they did in the West, China fundamentally disputes the entire foundation of the McMahon Line. According to the text, China's counter-argument is that the Simla Convention was a secret, backdoor deal concluded independently between Britain and Tibet.
And crucially, the Chinese central government never ratified it.
Which forces us to look at the retroactive legal status of Tibet, because India's stance relies heavily on the fact that Tibet had an independent status at the time of the 1914 convention.
Right. The text notes that in 1911, following the collapse of the Manchu dynasty, Chinese troops were expelled from Tibet. And in 1913, Tibet essentially declared complete independence. Therefore, India argues, Tibet possessed the sovereign authority to negotiate and sign international treaties on its own behalf, meaning China's ratification was entirely unnecessary.
What's fascinating here is China's counterclaim, because China claims historical suzerainty over Tibet.
Suzerainty, that's a good Scrabble word. What does that actually mean in this context?
So suzerainty is a concept where one powerful state claims ultimate control and foreign policy oversight over a vassal state, even if that vassal state manages its own internal affairs.
Ah, okay.
So China argues Tibet was never a wholly independent sovereign actor, but always under Chinese suzerainty.
Okay, let's unpack this. It's like looking at a massive corporate merger decades after the fact. If the executive who signed the paperwork wasn't legally the CEO of the company at the time, the entire contract is void today.
Yes.
The entire legal architecture of the eastern boundary rests on whether Tibet was legally the CEO of its own territory in 1913. If they were independent, the McMahon Line is a valid contract.
Hmm.
If they were under Chinese suzerainty, the contract is null and void.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. The CEO analogy works perfectly, and it highlights why the law aspect of our memory framework, history, geography, law, control, is so heavily contested.
Right. But as we move forward in the timeline, the source text reveals that paper treaties and legal arguments eventually give way to the final, most crucial variable: administrative control.
Yes. Because you can argue about suzerainty all day long, but effective control is what actually solidifies a border.
You need boots on the ground, outposts on the mountain passes, and, ink in the administrative ledgers. Squatters' rights versus absentee landlords.
Exactly. And the text provides a perfect, almost tragic case study of how this played out diplomatically. The 1960 officials report.
Oh, this meeting. It's a mess.
It really is. The prime ministers of India and China recognized the escalating friction and decided to have their respective officials meet, examine all the historical evidence, and finally settle the boundary.
But the negotiations failed spectacularly.
Completely fell apart.
And they failed because both sides walked into the room with entirely different definitions of what constituted evidence. According to the source, the Indian side produced a mountain of tangible documentation. Ancient chronicles, detailed surveys, local revenue records, and proof that they actively maintain checkposts at the border passes.
They even brought forward older Tibetan and Chinese documents to corroborate their claims.
But in stark contrast, the text claims that China could not produce equivalent evidence of administrative extension into the areas they were claiming.
No, it states they provided virtually no topographical details. Instead of administrative records, the Chinese delegation relied heavily on two secret maps.
Secret maps.
Yeah, one from their general staff and one from the Bureau of Survey. And these maps arbitrarily pushed their claim lines further east in 1956 and then pushed them even further in 1960.
So what does this all mean? It's impossible to negotiate when you don't even agree on the basic currency of proof. If one side brings centuries of localized tax receipts and the other brings freshly drawn military maps, there is just no shared framework for truth.
None at all. And the text explicitly notes this inconsistency, stating that the Chinese delegation would propound certain principles when it suited their territorial claims and just completely discard those exact same principles when they didn't.
So diplomacy was basically doomed from the start.
When two nations lack a common framework for truth, diplomatic negotiations inevitably collapse. There's no other outcome.
And when border negotiations collapse in a highly militarized zone, the consequences shift from political to lethal. Which brings us to the strategic consequences outlined in the text and the direct, tragic link to the 1962 Sino-Indian War.
We can trace this as a very clear escalation ladder based on the source.
Walk us through it.
So step one is boundary uncertainty. Because the 1960 talks failed, neither side agreed on where the line actually was.
Right.
Step two, that uncertainty leads to differences in how both militaries execute their forward patrolling. If you believe the line is 10 miles further north than your adversary believes it is, your patrols are going to overlap.
Which triggers step three, physical face-offs. Because overlapping patrols in remote, freezing conditions naturally lead to aggressive standoffs.
Exactly. And step four is the inevitable military escalation. The unresolved boundary became the direct trigger for full-scale war in October and November of 1962.
The text notes that Chinese forces advanced rapidly, pushing right up to their 1960 claim lines, and in several sectors pushing beyond them.
They did. Now, the aftermath of that brief but intense war is critical to understanding the map today.
Right, because things didn't just go back to normal. The text highlights a major divergence in how China handled the different sectors post-conflict. In the eastern sector, after advancing past the McMahon Line, Chinese forces ultimately declared a ceasefire and withdrew back behind it.
But crucially, no such withdrawal took place in the west. In Ladakh, specifically in the Aksai Chin region, Chinese forces held their ground.
Meaning, the line of actual control, the de facto border today, was pushed significantly further east into Indian-claimed territory than even China's original maps had indicated.
It connects all the strategic dots we've been talking about. The treaties debated in the 1840s, the maps drawn at Simla in 1914, and the failure to agree on administrative ledgers in 1960 directly dictated where infrastructure was built, where outposts were placed, and ultimately where thousands of troops fought and died in 1962.
So China secured the Aksai Chin corridor they needed to connect Xinjiang to Tibet.
Yes, fundamentally altering the geographic reality on the ground, regardless of the historical debate.
It is incredibly sobering to trace that line from a diplomatic disagreement over a 19th century treaty straight to modern military deployment. If we pull back and look at the broader lessons extracted from this source text, the structural failures become very clear.
Very clear. The diplomatic lesson is perhaps the most glaring. You simply cannot resolve a complex dispute if the negotiating parties don't agree on a shared baseline of evidence. If revenue records are met with secret military maps, diplomacy is paralyzed.
And the legal and geographical lesson highlights the immense friction between natural logic and imperial history. You have the objective geographical clarity of the watershed principle clashing directly against the murky, shifting interpretations of historical suzerainty and vassal states.
Finally, the military lesson is the starkest of all. Unresolved, ambiguous borders are not just political headaches, they are structural traps. When lines are undefined, nations inevitably push forward to establish effective control, and that forward posturing mathematically guarantees eventual conflict.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Let's do a quick rapid-fire revision, like audio flashcards, so you at home can really lock this in.
Oh, I love this.
Okay, key treaties. We had the 1684 Tingmos-Gang, the 1842 Ladakh-Tibet-China Treaty, and the 1914 Simla Convention.
Spot on. Key lines. You've got the Johnson Line in the north and the McMahon Line in the east.
And the key concept to remember. The watershed principle. Gravity and water deciding the borders. As we wrap up this deep dive, the memory framework we started with history, geography, law, and control shows exactly why this boundary remains so vexed. Every treaty, every mountain crest, and every historical maneuver is meticulously gathered and weaponized to legitimize a line on a map.
Which leaves us with a final thought to mull over. Our source material today reveals the staggering complexity of statecraft. But if two incredibly powerful nations can look at the exact same Himalayan mountain ranges, read the exact same centuries of imperial history, and analyze the exact same treaties, yet walk away with entirely contradictory maps,
Right.
is an objective border ever truly possible? Or are borders ultimately just temporary administrative agreements waiting in place until the balance of power shifts enough to redraw them?
That is a profound question to end on. Thank you for joining us as we explore the intricate architecture of the Indo-Tibet-China boundary dispute. We hope this deep dive gave you a robust, analytical framework to understand the history behind the headlines. Keep questioning the maps you see every day, and we'll catch you next time.